I'm going to introduce our next speaker now. George Ramos is with us. He is interested, as many of us know, in the theology and dramatic works of John Milton. He completed his doctoral dissertation, Waiting for God, Reconsidering Milton's Millenarianism at Western University in 2017, and currently teaches business at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario. He's a poet, playwright, director, actor, am I getting them all? And producer. Hey, I got it. In 2018, he directed a performance of Milton's Samson Agonistes at Western, which was being praised right before the session began. And this year, he is directing Shakespeare's Cymbeline at Western as part of the eco-critical global theater initiative called Cymbeline in the Anthropocene. Very nice. And did I say that wrong? Anthropocene, I can never get it right. Well, thank you, George.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming to our panel. I'll be presenting excerpts from one of my chapters in my dissertation. Just want to pay tribute to Elizabeth, who was my external examiner, and who was also at the our show. Our Samson show 2 years ago. All right, so today, I guess my purpose in presenting this paper is to help work through ideas on how my research is even more topical right now, as we are sort of in the end of the world with the pandemic, political situations all around the world, climate change, which I'm going to explore in my my play this summer. And find out what the implications are when looking at Milton's eschatology and millenarianism. Two thoughts I've been thinking of very recently is, number one, Christianity itself, I think, is more of an apocalyptic religion and faith than anything else. And at the same time, Milton is also an apocalyptic writer, poet in that same regard. So I'm wondering what the implications are of those two thoughts, especially as we reach the end of the world. My son, I spoke to my son, and he said that there's a lot of cynicism in his generation. My generation, I was born in the 80s. In the 90s, and were more idealistic and things, but their generation, who's lived through all this trials and tribulations through pandemic, there's a lot of cynicism and loss of faith and things. And my son, he feels that we won't get to the 22nd century because of climate change and all those difficulties. So I'm wondering what the I do have some thoughts as to what the implications are, and you'll see that in the end of the paper. But if everyone would kind of share any ideas, that would be great. Okay, so my paper is John Milton's Millenarianism, Reconsidered in Paradise Lost: The Eternally Recurring Beginnings and Ultimate End of the Sun's Kingdom. So I'll go through it now. So in the 17th century, the political religious ideology of millenarianism was the belief that in the end times, Christ would physically descend to rule the world with his saints for 1,000 years. It's inspired by a single passage in the Bible, Revelation 20:1-7. In this passage, St. John sees an angel descend from heaven and bind Satan for 1,000 years in the abyss. He then envisions the resurrection of saints, that is, martyrs and other faithful souls, unto whom judgment is given. These saints then lived and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years, after which Satan is released and the final apocalyptic war is instigated by him. Then Christ decisively defeats said Satan and begins the last judgment. So that's the thing. This belief in a terrestrial 1,000-year reign of Christ and his saints had been universally considered heretical by Protestants in the 16th century, but gradually gained acceptance in the following century. Became an important ideological buttress for anti-political and anti-monarchical forces in Parliament during the English Revolution. The traditional assessment of scholars holds that Milton was a millenarian from about 1640 to about the time of the Restoration, when the downfall of the Republic caused him to rethink this belief or abandon it altogether. the alternative view offered by the 2003 anthology, Milton and the Ends of Time, which itself was inspired by a similar sense of the end of the world, Y2K, in the turn of the millennium in 2003, particularly Miltonists like Lewalski, Rivard, and Lowenstein. They proposed that Milton adhered to millenarianism from his early years prior to 1640 and continued to do so well beyond the Restoration in 1660. Their own ideological priorities are at stake when they suggest that Milton's radicalism had helped shape Western liberal democracy. I discern in their work the influence of Whig and Marxist scholars who have appropriated the millenarian emphasis on radical apocalyptic transformation, which had been motivated by political and economic oppression as a core component of grand narratives of progress, enlightenment, class conflict, and socioeconomic upheaval. Norman Cohn's ideas about class war, as exemplified by revolutionary millenarianism in the medieval period, contributed much to this scholarly tradition. In my thesis, I challenge both the traditional and alternative positions on millenarianism in Milton's work. I argue that Milton never believed in millenarianism and had no definitive evidence for millenarianism, and that no definitive evidence for millenarianism exists in Milton's English poetry and prose. I contend that throughout his career, millenarianism was antithetical to Milton's deeply held convictions, particularly his belief in the liberty of individual conscience. In Paradise Lost, for instance, at the end of history, when millenarians expected the sun's 1,000-year earthly kingdom to begin, his kingdom ends when God is all in all. The sun's kingdom actually had already begun in the beginning of time and began again and again with each humiliation and exaltation the sun underwent in order to mediate communion between creator and creation. As Paradise Lost shows, what Milton believes in most deeply is that in the end, there will be only one king in the universe, the Father, whose glory and bliss will be indistinguishable from those of all things. So precisely when did the sun's kingdom begin? Milton denies us an easy answer to this question. The epic points to multiple exaltations of the sun, and thus to his kingdom's multiple beginnings. Each time we consider one beginning, there's always another one that precedes it. In Book 3, for example, when before the fall, the Son volunteers to die an earthly death for man's redemption, the Father declares to the assembled angels that the Son will gain a future glorious kingship during the last judgment. Yet the Father's pronouncement itself also exalts the Son in the prelapsarian present of the speech. Moreover, in the Father's pronouncement and in Michael's speech to Adam in Book 12, the Son's ascension into heaven after the crucifixion is another exaltation that will occur more immediately prior to that of the last judgment. This one will begin the Son's spiritual kingdom, another prelapsarian exaltation, which establishes the Son's supremacy over the angels, antedates all these in Raphael's narrative of the war in heaven to Adam in Book 5. It takes place before and directly provokes Satan's rebellion, but it only seems to be the primordial beginning. In that particular scene, all the angels gathered before the throne of the Father, mirroring the exaltation of Book 3, and the Father says, "Hear all ye angels, progeny of light, thrones, dominions, princedoms, virtues, power. Hear my decree, which unrevoked shall stand. This day I have begot, whom I declare my only Son, and on this holy hill have him anointed, whom ye now behold at my right hand. Your head I him appoint, and by him have sworn to him shall bow all knees in heaven, and shall confess him Lord. Under his great vice-regent reign abide, united as one individual soul, forever happy. Him who disobeys me disobeys, breaks union, and that day, cast out from God and blessed vision, falls into utter darkness, deep engulfed his place, ordained without redemption, without end." Critics in the 19th and 20th centuries, including Seurat and Nemsen, were confused by this passage. They took begot to mean the literal begetting or creation of the Son, which would have thus had occurred on the same day as this inauguration of his vice-regent reign. They saw this as a glaringly inconsistent with Abdiel's declaration to Satan that the Father, through the agency of the Son, had created all things, including angels. The entire heavenly host is present when God exalts the Son. So how could the Son have caused the angels to have come into being when he himself had just been formed? In 1926, Herbert Grierson had by then made an important breakthrough. The metaphorical meaning of begot in Scripture is exalted, as Milton himself acknowledges when briefly discussing the sources of the passage in De Doctrina. The literal begetting of the Son, which is thus yet another beginning altogether, is a mysterious event that complicates the apparent primordiality of the Son's exaltation in Book 5. Milton omits this from the narrative and accepts that we are told that he was the agent of creation. The Son's status prior to this exaltation is completely unknown. As if it were all not enough, Fowler observes in his edition of Paradise Lost that the Son is begot, that is exalted, on 2 more occasions later on during the war in heaven, when he mounts the Father's chariot and after he routs the rebel angels. Even the mere suggestion of the Father that the Son ascend the chariot is a begetting of this nature. The Father does indeed always endeavor to glorify the Son. As Fowler writes, Milton seems to have envisaged a series of metaphorical generations and exaltations. By doing this and locating the literal begettings of the Son and the angel in time immemorial and shrouding them in mystery, Milton emphasizes that despite the millenarians' fervent anticipation of new beginning, the Son's kingdom has in fact already begun. Critics have also been puzzled by Milton's inclusion of 2 similar ritualistic prelapsarian exaltations of the Son by the Father before angelic audiences, the one in Book 5, which I quoted above, and the other in Book 3. The latter occurs later in the time scheme of the narrative than the former, though it appears earlier in the poem. The Father had just revealed that Satan, who is en route to the newly created earth, will succeed in tempting Adam and Eve. The Son then expresses his willingness to atone for man's transgressions by becoming a man himself and dying. And the Father, though Book 5 tells us that he had already done so, rewards him by making him a king. And I'll just briefly quote, because thou hast, though throned in highest bliss, equal to God and equally enjoying godlike fruition, quitted all to save a world from utter loss, and hast been found by merit more than birthright Son of God, found worthiest to be so by being good, far more than great or high, because indeed love had abounded more than glory abounds. Therefore thy humiliation shall exalt with thee thy manhood also to this throne. Here sit thou incarnate, here shall reign both God and man, Son, both of God and man, anointed universal King, all power I give thee, reign forever. Grant Macaulay points out to the impropriety of describing God as twice exalting his Son as such a divine decree as the exaltation was as irrevocable as it is eternal. According to Emerson, Book 3 and 5 on this view must report the same scene in heaven, and different aspects of it were merely separated for the literary requirements of epic construction. He notes, as I have above, that the Son is exalted again after the war in heaven, and that one possibility, which he thinks is doubtful, is that the purposes of the Father, through though eternal, were realized gradually in time. For his part, Alan Gilbert hints that the duplication resulted from the late composition of Book 3, and Macaulay similarly accounts for the perceived anomaly by suggesting that the sequence of the poem's plot points were determined by Milton only after a substantial amount of the poetry had been written. Other scholars contend that Milton was careless. Emerson proposes an easy solution to the problem. God foreknew the effects of the first exaltation of the Son in Book 5, that is, Satan's rebellion, his temptation of Adam and Eve, and his subsequent fall on man, and indeed exalted the Son because he foreknew the Son would choose incarnation, during which the Son would redeem mankind through his own death. In arguing against the fortunate fall, Danielson presents a more radical explanation. In his view, Milton highlights the prelapsarian exaltation of the Son in Book 5 as head of the angels in order to suggest that the Son's kingdom necessitates neither an angelic fall nor a human one. Moreover, Danielson elaborates on a note in Fowler's edition that Abdiel appears to regard the Messiah's kingship over the angels as a kind of incarnation in his admonition of the rebellious angels in book 5. Just as the humiliation, quote, of the Son's human incarnation foretold by God in book 3 will exalt him, exalt his manhood, so the angels, as Abdiel asserts, are not obscured by the Son's reign, but rather more illustrious made, since he, the head, one of our number, thus reduced becomes. The implication is that even if Adam and Eve had not transgressed, man would still have enjoyed this gracious condescension of the Son towards God's creatures within a Christocentric universe. Danielson writes that the Son's being proclaimed Messiah, King anointed, in every sense precedes the fall. In other words, if either Adam or Milton's reader hear the echo of these words spoken in book 5, he will have cause to recall that that anointing of the Messiah was an accomplished fact before the fall, indeed before the foundation of the world. That's a quote. Here's what I suggest. I suggest that the Son's exaltation in book 5 does not precede the fall in every sense. For instance, just before the outbreak of the war in heaven, God commands Abdiel to join Michael's angelic host and engage with the rebels who refuse for their King Messiah, who by right of merit reigns. As Hunter observed, William B. Hunter, the Son merits his kingship only after the crucifixion, which is yet to happen in the future and is a consequence of the fall. I argue that these other critics, Macaulay and Gilbert, are in a sense correct. The exaltations of book 3 and book 5 and all other exaltations of the Son and the beginnings of his kingdom are, in a manner of speaking, the same event. They are eternal recurrences of the primordial beginning that manifests during discrete historical occasions. Since that first beginning, which occurs even before the earliest chronological event in the epic, that is, the exaltation in book 5, and through each successive beginning, the Father constantly seeks to connect with creation through the Son and the Son's kingdom. This connection is enabled by the incarnation or humiliation of the Son that, as Danielson argues, accompanies each of his exaltations. Stevie Davies makes a similar point about the exaltation in book 5 and uses the same speech by Abdiel as evidence. According to her, in order to attain a closeness or a greater equality among the community in heaven, such that the Son is primus inter pares for the angels, the Godhead must descend and reduce itself while simultaneously exalting the community, quote unquote. This is the essential nature of the Son's kingdom. For God and his creatures too, as the Father puts it, quote, under the Son's great vice-regent reign abide, united as one individual soul, forever happy, unquote. Abdiel expresses his sentiment eloquently, trying to reassure Satan, who is about to rebel. He says how provident the Father is, how far from thought to make us less bent, rather to exalt our happy state under one head, the Son's more near united. I contend that one particular humiliation of the Son is a preeminent and eternal resonant effect that is both recurrent and retroactive. This is the Son's incarnation and mortal death. It is this ultimate humiliation that makes the eternal recurrence of these beginnings possible. This explains why the Son literally, quote, by right of merit reigns long before the event that earns him that right. In other words, the Father's renewed invitation to his creatures to partake in union with him through the Son's sacrifice is so powerful and efficacious that it eternally reverberates backwards and forwards in time. Thus, the Son's kingdom, in its fullest sense, is not to be sought in a future millennium. It is already manifest, and Milton implies that it has been manifest since the literal beginning of the Son in the beginning of time. I'm going to skip my section on how De Doctrina proves that in book 15. You can come back to that later. Just want to conclude now. To conclude, Milton did not believe in an imminent millennium, but this perspective entailed a deeply felt yearning for union with an imminent divinity, whether in the final kingdom of the new heaven and earth or in the paradise regained of the present within himself in the old earth. He deplored fleshly and coercive theocracy and instead celebrated individual Christian liberty guaranteed by a provident natural world alive with the voice of God. It does not wish for a transformative improvement in our fallen condition that a millennial kingdom might bring. Rather, it desires the reversal of the fall itself in the new kingdom, in the new heaven and new earth, a state of praise that is already perfectly available on earth through this constant humiliation and exaltation. He promotes a reformation not for his own sake, but for that of an external and progressive kingdom that will pave the way for the millennium. Not for that, but for the preservation of the sanctity of the spiritual kingdom within. Indeed, in line with St. Paul, and I'm in my last page now, Milton aspires for perfect spiritual unity with the divine, not for the material and fleshly benefits and order of millennial reign. The Son has constantly humiliated and exalted himself in order to connect with creation. Milton is enraptured by this in the present, but ultimately he looks forward for his own exaltation in heaven when all things will be renewed. He longs not for yet another beginning of the Son's kingdom, but for its end, so that the benefits which he already avails of in the present, might be fully attained. Okay, I'll just say one more thing. And I think as we have a set in the time of the pandemic, I think one of the key takeaways of the apocalypticism of Milton and of Christianity generally is actually epistemological fluidity, right? Rather than any kind of ideological fixity, right? So I submit a careful study of Milton's eschatology exposes an epistemological fluidity, that's what I'm trying to say, that precludes any Christian ideological fixity. He does not imagine the end times with the rigid materialistic and fantastical specificity of millenarians of the specificity of early modern or classical millenarians, or even present day ones, but with the spiritual openness, faith, hope, or ambivalence that allows him to already experience the blessedness of the final kingdom through the imminent divinity that presently exists in the paradise within and in the vital natural world. It's like, I just go back to the plurality of Miltonic ideology, which Corns points us to. So I guess, just to close, my work explores kind of these ideas. If we look at Milton, is really kind of almost ambivalent between wishing for the final kingdom, final blessedness, and the final, the imperfect glorification available now through this constant beginning and the eternal recurrence of God's kingdom, right? So there's more toleration, pluralism, and even some kind of Nietzschean postmodernism in Milton. Okay, that's it. Thank you.